have, and it's my pleasure to introduce, is Mr. Michael J. Bayer. He's President and Chief Executive Officer of Dumbarton Strategies, who will share his thoughts on the impact of the uncertain national budget and what it'll do to Army aviation. Mr. Bayer has served and continues to serve on a wide variety of boards. Previously, he served as the Vice Chair and Chairman of the United States Department of Defense Business Board. He was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the United States Department of Energy and served as counselor to President Bush's Commission on Aviation Security and Terrorism. Michael served as a member of the United States Army Science Board from 1990 to 1992 and as its chairman from 1998 to 2002. He is currently a member of the Defense Science Board, where he has served since 1997. Most recently, Michael headed up the transition team for Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. He has a close affinity to Army aviation, as his son served as an Apache pilot in the 101st. Please give a warm Army aviation welcome to Mr. Michael Bayer.
Well, thank you all. It's a terrific pleasure to be here and to be among this great company. I am, as someone who's a denizen of Washington, I get to see the enormous influence that this association has. You are so well led by Howard Yellen, who I have had the great pleasure to work with over the years, and I'm excited about the transition to E.J. Sinclair, another terrific leader. This is truly an association that matters, and it's a special pleasure for me to be here. I think this morning, Howard has set up a very interesting bookend between General Keane and myself. I could not agree more with everything that Jack told you today. The wisdom of those words and the experience underlying it are really profound. You are blessed to have such people. What I'm going to talk about is a very different bookend to that in which you find yourselves. The demand and the two different demand and push-pulls. So that bookend is what I want to chat about. You've heard throughout the days here and the year before what sequestration and Budget Control Act are doing to the Defense Department, to the Army, and to Army aviation. What I want to do is give you a little context so you understand what is the geographic pull the opposite direction. Why, with the eloquence of the points made by General Keane and by your Chief of Staff and by your aviation branch, or do we still have sequestration? Why hasn't it gone away? Well, I can't explain that completely, but what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of history and background and a little bit of now to kind of lay that out. So if I can have the first slide. I hope. May I have the first? Do I push these things? Oh, there it is. Okay, now we're up. Okay, here we go. So this is what we're going to talk about. This is the defense budget over time in constant dollars. Most people look at the budget in as spent dollars. But if you see it in constant dollars, you get to see what a mathematician would say is a bit of curiosity. You don't have to be a sailor to recognize the tide chart here. And so there is a little of this that we're going to peel out in the minutes to follow. So now if I can have the next slide. So the difference about this future, the future that you face, is pretty profound versus the preceding years from, let's say, 85 to 2000. And let me give you a couple of those indices. Uniform personnel costs were much lower then, meaning you didn't get paid much. The benefit programs hadn't begun explosive growth, meaning there weren't a lot of side benefits for anybody. Healthcare was a small and a relatively stable portion of the budget. O&M was manageable. Most of the gear was new. And the active military force was the greatest portion of the eligibilities of various benefit and pay programs. Now, next slide. Today, it's really different. The departmentals, and this is what we're going to talk about today. The fundamental cost drivers are different. The allocation between deployable forces and the institutional enterprise, both in the Army as well as defense, are different. And the internal and external political balance of power is really different as well. So next slide. A lot of you have heard that some of the choices made in the previous downturns were unwise, and we'll never repeat those mistakes again. Well, I'm actually here to show you evidence about why, at the time, the men that were leading America's military were making their choices based on the best available information. Now, next slide. This is a fairly famous chart in the Pentagon that doesn't get out much. First of all, this is as spent dollars. The big black line is the defense budget. And all those little colored lines were what the planners in the Department of Defense, in the services, and in the White House thought the budgets were going to be. And as you see, the correlation of those plans versus reality is somewhat strained. This is not just an old phenomenon, but more importantly, if you were a chief in those days and the budget starts to turn down in '85, which is that first spike about a third of the way across, that's the end of the Reagan buildup, you would have thought, based on the plans that were provided to you and the data, that the budgets were going to continue to increase. So you would have made particular choices that in hindsight look really bad. But in fact, they were very rational choices at the time. But this phenomena of the disconnect between reality and plans is not just unique to this period. Next slide. This is the current situation. And again, we're in these are then year dollars. So this is as spent money. Notice the difference between what the plans are and what the budgets are. And those swings, if you look at the left side of that chart, the disconnect between plan and reality is a lot of money. Next slide. So that leads me to the next point I want to talk about, which is sequestration is seen as the problem, but in fact, if you're just being coldly analytical about it, it actually just makes the underlying problems happen sooner. Now, what the heck does that mean? Let me show you. Next slide. So the cost drivers I told you were different. Here are the two biggest issues, personnel and O&M. Personnel is growing at 4.2% a year, and O&M costs 2.7% a year, and that's been pretty constant. There are people that have looked at this with far more skill than myself, and they say that if that isn't changed by 2021, which is really pretty close at hand, O&M and personnel will consume 86% of the total defense budget. And by 2026, it's 100%. It grows that fast. 100% of the defense budget in 10 years goes to people and O&M, the current budget. That's a problem. Next slide. Compensation is what's driving this. And I hope you can see this. I can't see it down there, but I can see it if I look over here. So I'll try to do this for those of you in the back that can't see it. This is off of the Army recruiting page. This is goarmy.com. And it shows the difference between the pay of a civilian job and the pay of a military job. The top job is a military policeman versus a civilian cop. Just looking at base pay, the civilian policeman is doing pretty well. The numbers that you can't see are 49 versus 29. But if I drop down to net income, and I have to look this way so I can read the number for you. Net income, the civilian policeman makes 36.3, the military policeman 53.9. It's goarmy.com. On civilian versus military compensation for people with electrical engineering degrees and decide to be signal officers, the signal officer makes less money in cash than his civilian counterpart by a difference of $67,000 to $52,000 a year. But net, the civilian makes 54.4, the military officer makes 78.1. That's a new phenomena that the budget processes have not fully embraced, not understood this. And this effect across the force is what's driving those personnel costs up. I'm for this pay, by the way, but it changes what has been a historical pattern of cost allocation. So I'm not against any of this. Understand I support it, but point here, these are phenomena that are way outside the norm of that tide chart that I showed you on slide 1. Next slide. The other question you get to is cutting yourself out of the problem. There are a lot of demands that force structure be reduced. Well, there's actually a pattern for this. Your brother service, the Air Force, and your brother service, the Navy, cut forces in the late 2000s in order to meet the fact that they were under a pretty tight top line as the Army was consuming a larger portion of defense budgets. During that period, as you can see, the Air Force drew its strength down by 7%, but its personnel costs went up by 16%. They reduced their inventory by 10%, but their O&M went up by 19%. Again, very historically anomalous. The same numbers occurred in the Navy for the CNO when he was reducing his body count and his platform count. His costs continued to go up. Next slide. This is what it looks like per service member, O&M and MilPers. And you can see that trend against a fixed or declining bottom line is a recipe for disaster over time. Next slide. So the fundamentals are really, really different than those previous downturns. Next slide. Some of those other fundamentals are this fourth estate. You've all heard about it. These are the defense agencies and staffs. Those defense agencies and staffs now consume essentially a quarter of the defense budget. When I was a pup, and Jack Keane was, it was 1/3 Army, 1/3 Air Force, 1/3 Navy, Marine Corps, in rough numbers. Today, it's 25, 25, 25, 25. That is a huge shift in where it's going. Now, more about why that's expensive in Block 2. Staffs are very, very expensive. If you take a typical staff, it costs about 3 times more per body than a typical forces structure. So an infantry brigade, from the senior colonel that commands it to the lowest private, a carrier task force with a flag, rear admiral, lower half, to the lowest enlisted skill in the deck plates. You average all those grades and run up a cost per body, and you compare that with OSD, Joint Staff, Combatant Commander staffs, it's 3-to-1. So we have in OSD, the Joint Staff, the Combatant Commander staffs, and the component commanders to the combatant commanders, just those staffs. We have 93,000 people. 93,000 people. The officers in that staff are 3 times more expensive than forces per body. So if you're talking about a body count, the first question I would have is, what kind of bodies are we talking about? Because if we're talking forces, the average age on a carrier is 19 3/4 years. They're pretty cheap bodies. I don't know what the average age is in an infantry brigade, but I bet you all know, and I'll bet it's very low. And it's a very junior grade per average, because there's only a couple of very senior guys in that staff. The OSD and joint staffs now are running about 4,000 apiece. 4,000 apiece. The National Security Council staff is 455 bodies. This is very expensive help. That many officers don't fit back into forces. So you end up with what I've referred to the chairman and to the service chiefs as the staff clouds, because you have all of these grade of officers of an average 5.5, 5.5, that don't go back into the staffs cleanly, and back into forces cleanly, so they tend to rotate and hover between combatant commands, service staffs, schools, and so on. They're the most expensive bodies you have in the military. 3x the cost of forces. And those staffs have a huge portion of the available contractor force, which is also adding to the costs that you hear so much about. Much different than it used to be. 3 times the cost in large numbers. Next slide. There's also external factors that are important. The ambivalent electorate. For all of the power of the arguments of Jack Keane, Gordon Sullivan, and many, many other people, sequestration remains the law of the land. And also the industrial base's consolidated political power has removed some of the freedoms of motion of the senior leaders of the department. We've had a case, the Army's had cases where you've wanted to end production lines and the industrial base as your partner has taken that under advice and you're still spending money on those things. That would have been unthinkable years before. But they are now consolidated and are a peer for you politically. The traditional hill giants have been replaced by a divided, much lighter weight people. And I don't mean intellectually, I don't mean morally. These are men and women who haven't been in these seats as long as the great old graybeards and the lions of the Senate days. And we've got a larger and larger outspoken retiree program that are beginning to have a greater and greater view about compensation, benefits, commissaries, their locations, and so on. In 1985, it was barely 1-to-1. You're now breaking through 2-to-1, 2 retirees for every active duty person. And within a few years, you'll be at 4-to-1. The political balance of power in the military will be with its retired community, not with its active duty or active vanguard and reserve. It's really important. The division of power is active in all capacities versus retired. Next. Question is, okay, will there be more money? Well, this gets us to budget physics. And this is the cruelest calculus of all. Next slide. This is what discretionary budget for DOD as a percentage of discretionary spending has been over time. So now this isn't the percentage of the whole budget. This is the percentage of discretionary spending. So civilian and military discretion, what's the mix? That's the 100%. Notice if we go back pre-Vietnam, it's very, very high. Now I'll show you what it looks like as the whole budget in a minute, but this is just discretionary spending. And look at that trend over time. Now there are those that believe it will go forward. See the straight line at 50? Next slide. There's how it correlates. That's a very high R-squared correlation. That is one of the big key pieces about why this is tough in the out years. Now, why is that occurring? Next slide. This is total federal spending. This is the percentage of federal spending, which is defense versus civilian, and you see it over a long sweep of time. It starts at 62 on the far left side, 1962, and goes all the way to 2018. The dark blue is defense, the light blue is civilian discretionary, and the light green is the mandatory and interest cost. So the entitlements, interest, mandatory spending. I'll also say that light blue has a large chunk of money for which you are deeply dependent upon. The nuclear weapons activities, homeland security. Lots of work going on in that blue section that Dr. Carter and others assert correctly the Department of Defense is deeply dependent on. They're dependent upon you, of course, but you have equities in that blue piece as much as they have in you. But now what's going on in there? What's the detail here? Here's the next one. Next slide. This is what it looks like over time in as spent dollars. Again, same color combination with a new one. Dark blue at the bottom is defense. Light blue, civilian discretionary. The green is entitlements, the light green. The green on the top, the brighter green, chartreuse, or whatever color that may show up to you as. Is chartreuse green? I don't even know. Anyway, the other green. That's interest on the national debt. Now, a little bit of history. Traditionally, the national debt, all of it, is paid for, as you know, by people that are buying treasury bills in the United States and around the world. traditional interest rate of that is 6% on the whole. Actually, it's 6.5. For the last bunch of years, on all of that, it's barely 2%. Today, that bill is $348 to $50 billion a year. We spend every year on interest. It's pretty outrageous, right? But that's at 2%. You don't have to be much of a mathematician to guess that if it were to go halfway back to 6, it would be twice that money. It would wipe out the entire defense budget, all of it. Now, if you really want the good news, you should know that Janet Yellen, no relation to Howard, I don't think so, is about to raise the interest rates. And as that interest rate starts to creep up, you hear people now saying, I want to refinance my home before the rates go up. I mean, I'm sure some of you have heard that. Well, there's another thing that goes up with the real estate interest rates. That's the rate on that little tiny blue amount. That little blue amount ends up being, as someone said, I wish I'd have thought of it, that's sort of the Death Star that sort of creeps out around behind the planet, and you think, where the heck did that come from? Because its ability to do destruction to the defense and civilian budgets are pretty profound. And that green thing in the middle, that big growing green thing, which does not include all the cost of the new health care bill, that green thing can't be touched. That bill at the top is paid for by the 2 bars at the bottom. Next slide. So budget trends and top lines. Now we're going to go back to the tide chart. So next slide. Here's the cyclicality thing again. And so the far left is Korea. Then you've got the Vietnam buildup, Reagan, and of course the post 9/11 buildup. But a couple things to pay attention to here. Note the severity of the post-Korean drawdown, and then look at Vietnam. The peak of that Vietnam budget is fiscal year 1969. Relevant to the discussion last night, remember, 69 budget became law on October the 1st, 1968. That was months after Tet. That's when the budget starts to knee over. Knees over, pretty good then. What's happening in Vietnam? The war is actually just getting going. Now look at Reagan. See that very tight peak at Reagan? That's fiscal year 1985. 1985. October 1984 is the budget pass. Ronald Reagan is doing a commercial called Is There a Bear in the Woods, describing how fearful Americans were about the Soviet Union. The relationship with the Soviets cannot be, well, could have been worse. That was one of the worst times in the relationship with the Soviet Union, and the budget starts down. So whenever anyone tells you that facts on the ground matter as to budgets, I beg you, look at this chart. I'll also show you, too, that the one really solid correlation is the bottom end of it. It always bottoms out at the same level. Now, again, that's all the way through about 2000, because in 2000, all the fundamentals change in the budget. So that norm, which goes back quite a ways, is now being recast. Next slide. So force structure. What's the impact of all this? Next slide. Start with the beginning. It is hard to imagine in the modern military where we really began, which is World War II. The Navy had 107 aircraft carriers. Anybody know how many we had at the Battle of Midway? 5. 5 aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway. We end with 107. Now there's jeeps and all sorts of things in there. It's a bunch of dogs and cats. But I think Jack Keane said something about quantity has a quality all its own. Boy, this is quantity. 23 battleships, including, not counting the 3 that we never raised at Pearl Harbor. The Army had 100 divisions, and God knows how many other division equivalents of stuff. And the Air Corps, just in those 3 bombers, we had 30,000. We built 17,000 B-17s. Just so you remember, we built 21 B-2s. Quantity has a quality all of its own. But we're not going to start with World War II. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to start with the peak of the Reagan buildup on force structure. Next slide. This is what we had in 1985. This is the peak of the defense budget, sort of. I'll explain that in a bit. And if you look at this, you can see manpower along the top, Army divisions, Marine divisions, aircraft, capital ships, and the battleships are counted in this era because those are those are task force level leaders at that point. That's what we got in 1985. The budget stops at the end of fiscal year 84 and starts down for fiscal year 85. Next slide. This is what happens, and we're going to go through this in 5-year increments. So in 1990, now we're 5 years ahead. Notice the budget anomalies here. Look down at the bottom. John Lehman actually gets 2 more carriers out of mothballs and they're sailed. They're doomed, but he's brought them out. So the actual capital ship count, 5 years into a budget decline, the capital ship count's still going up because all that stuff is bought. And you can see the aircraft for the Air Force, those two green airplanes at the far right side of your chart, those are B-2s coming on, again, had already been bought. And there's a couple of little other adjustments. Now let's go to 1995. Next slide, there we go. Now you start to see the impact of what is now 10 years into the budget decline. The battleships fall out of the Navy. So a tremendous amount of money was spent to bring them out, man them, 5,000 plus bodies per boat, just on the ships, turn them back in. The Air Force starts to take enormous cuts in bombers and in tactical fighters. The Army starts to lose divisions, and we start to lose a lot of bodies. Now the body losses are somewhat softened by the IT revolution. We start to wind more information technology. And so these body losses are not felt as much as you would otherwise think because we start to pull out very specific skill sets. Next slide. Now we're at 2000. The Army loses 2 more divisions, more bodies come out, and the Navy starts to stand down. During that period of time, the 5 years there, the Navy stood down a bunch more carriers. Now they're down at 10, 11 carriers. Something else happens in 2000, and that is that having made those force structure cuts, we're out of money again. This is about 98. General Keane was there when that happened. And what happens is that 1/3 of the force gets pulled out more. So the Army went from divisions, I'm going to use just a couple of rough numbers here. In an armored division, the Army went from 330 tanks plus or minus to 220 plus or minus. The carriers pulled off the decks, F-14s, all kinds of other aircraft came off of those vessels, and they lost mountains of yellow gear. So the hollowing out occurred prior to 2000 in what was the second wave of reductions not shown on this chart. So that's where we are at 2000. Now we're at the eve of September 11th, and what was the butcher's bill? Next page. So here were the cuts of force structure in that period of time. Those are the divisions that are lost. We've got 8 divisions, 2,400 aircraft, and we've got 252 ships, a huge portion of which a huge portion of the capital fleet has lost during this period of time. This was with the old paradigm of pay, income, O&M, and most of this fleet is in pretty good shape because Reagan had bought a huge amount of it during that period of time for everybody. Next slide. This is what the costs look like. For those of you in the back, I'll try to read this. So the budget goes down by 24%. But here's the important point. What happens to force structure? Go down to the bottom. The Navy capital ships go down by 47%. Wait a minute, you guys are all aviators. You got perfect vision. You ought to be able to see this. And those that you can't read it have to report to the flight surgeon, I'm told. So on the aircraft for the Air Force, roughly a 50% reduction. Army divisions go down by 44%. I'll get to and the body counts go down by 1/3. So what does that mean? Rule of thumb, 25% budget, 33% bodies, 50% force structure. That's a huge butcher spill. But more importantly, look at the two green numbers at the top. O&M per active over that 15-year period goes up by 42%. Look what happens to military personnel costs over 15 years, 1.4%. That's how we did it. Next slide. Now, if we take that force structure and we update it to 2010, the last peak of the budget. Next. This is what we've got. If you go down to the people line, second line of bodies, there's a little green man. Those are the acquisition professionals that were put in by the Congress. The blue bodies are the contractors. And the reason they're not in the earlier slides is because there's no counts of them. There's no way to know what they were. But there they are in this slide. So fair to say there's no data that enables those to be put in the earlier years. The Army gains and loses another division. That red division is actually an artifact of the stand-up for the Second Iraq invasion. If you remember, we built a division out of pieces, sent it, and then brought it back and knocked it back down. That red division is it. So that's just an accounting thing. That's 2010. Now here's the numbers now. Let's go to the next slide. Bingo. All right, there's the difference. Let's pass that. That's obvious. Next. Cuts to force structure. So during this period of time, we actually lose a little bit more. We lose more airplanes. We lose more ships. Now that's, again, from 85 to 2010. So now we're looking at a 25-year swing. But next slide, this is what we really want to pay attention to. Here's the costs. And again, I'm going to lean over and read these. During this period of time, from 1985 to 2010, the defense budget goes up by 35%. Manpower is down by a third, and our force structure, we have 44% less Army divisions, better than 50% less U.S. Air Force aircraft, and about 50% less capital ships in the Navy. So we spend 35% more, and we've got less bodies, and we've got less stuff. Next slide. So how does that work if left unimpeded? And this is pure hypothesis. Don't think this is going to happen, but it gives you a sense of the pressures. If we were to do another downturn like we did before, here's what happens. Next. That's the number you start with. Next, you pull out 44% of the budget over time, and you end up with, next, this is the force structure. You end up with essentially half of what you got. That's what would happen. That's the natural flow of the budget. That's why the pressures are so high. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. We don't need to spend time on that. All of that assumes the consumption and distribution patterns of the 15 years that preceded September 11th. Next slide. So again, what's different about that time? The staffs in the fourth estates, the most expensive manpower, is expanding. Uniform personnel costs are way up. Benefits costs are very, very high. Healthcare is a very significant program for the military. It's $500 billion unfunded. And the important part is it's growing faster than the private sector. And if you hear people say the military health care program is not out of bed, it's important to remind everyone that anyone with a chronic long-term problem is discharged off the policy and sent to the VA. They're not your bill anymore. And you get to pre-screen everyone coming in, and you hold to the active and guard and reserve service members a level of physical fitness and readiness that doesn't apply to the civilian sector. So on all things considered, your health care costs should be lower. In fact, they're higher on most of the indices. Your platforms are getting older. and your upgrades, because they have so much IT content, whether it's Apaches or, for heaven's sakes, even Humvees, have an IT content and a short shelf life of that content that never existed before. So next slide. And if that isn't bad enough, the Congress isn't giving you any help. Next slide. Next slide. These are the disapproved efficiencies and the impact per year on your budget. No BRAC, just $2 billion. Compensation reform, again, I'm not for it or against it, but this was the department's position, $4 billion a year. Equipment retirements prevented, $6 billion a year. Navy surface cruisers, $1 billion a year. Other efficiencies denied, 3. Sequestration, 24. And OCO to base is another number, whether it's going to go up or down, so I leave that off. But if I leave OCO out, it's $40 billion a year. 40 billion. Think of how much Army, how much Navy, how much Air Force, how much Marine Corps could be bought with $40 billion in found money every year. At a time in which your costs are growing way faster than a flat budget or even the GNP deflator that people talk about giving you. Next slide. So the bottom line is that the pressures to dramatically reduce U.S. capacity and capability are what I wanted to show you today. This is the offset of Jack's brief. So somewhere between these two is the future. And the answer, the solution to that is the leadership. Jack said it's all about leadership, and I believe it is too. It's the leadership of great men and women who articulate Jack's message, managing the inside problems and putting those two together for solution. So that's what I wanted to chat with you today. I'm sorry for such a grim message early on. I hope afterwards you have some coffee and brighten yourselves up. But I believe the future is Jack's, not mine. But you only get to that if you fear this. This is what you must know and avoid, because it animates everything. So I wish you all the best. God bless you. Thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for all your extraordinary service to date and that to follow. Thank you.